Fantastic. So welcome everybody. This is going to be a really fun time. I normally start by thanking our panel, and I will do, but really I want to thank the audience first. Why? Because we've had some fantastic questions on this topic come in already. I will say that for hygiene, as we move along, if you think of something that you want to say, please use the Q&A tab up on the top left next to the chat button as well. And it's not the starter discussion, it's the Q&A piece as well. So yeah, really looking forward. I think we can answer about 90+%, I'm feeling confident, of those questions as we move through. But we do have a little bit of time at the back end of this if we don't. So Stephen, thank you for facilitating that. And thank you for keeping me honest if we don't answer all of those questions as we move along. So once again, welcome everyone. I'm Chris. I'm the co-founder of SGT. I really love helping our customers drive and sustain change at the seller level, their fingertips, their DNA. Love helping our customers to get towards, for example, 15 quarters of consecutive growth for things like services-led sales transformation. So I'm really interested in those types of topics and really enjoying running this company with Matt over the past 4 years with seller transformations out there globally. And we'll be coming on to those topics specifically as we move forward and step through. So welcome our panel. So Jason is an AWS veteran, currently VP US Enterprise and Private Equity at AWS. We have Kristen, founder of Enablement Consult, and also leading light in a variety of different roles at Google, Salesforce, Microsoft, and AWS as well. Matt, my co-founder, is someone who loves to drive change and was instrumental in leading a Fortune 500 company on their particular product set, where their strategy changed and led revenue growth from 15 million to 3.8 billion in assets under contract. So welcome, panel.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, good. Thank you, one and all. So let's get into this. But before we start, I'd love the audience to get to know you a little bit personally before we start. So something a bit away from work. I know this might feel a little bit cringy, but I'm going to put you on the spot, guys, anyway. So I'd love to know something about you professionally that your colleagues don't know about you. So something that's not necessarily tied to work, sorry, not professionally in your private life, and something that your colleagues might not know about you. And because I've asked the nasty question straight off the bat, I'll go first. So believe it or not, in July of 2022, I found myself in the classic race, the Tour de France. So I was in France. I was on a bike ride with my best friend from university. We were heading down the mountain. We'd paused halfway. It was the rest day on the Tour de France, and we got chatting to a couple of Tour de France riders. We had a coffee. We bought them a coffee. They bought us another coffee. They said, "Where are you headed to?" We said, "Morzine." They said, "We are as well. Head down with us." So we went down in the peloton of this tour, and we went down with them. There were people waving. Of course, we were waving back and enjoying our 15 minutes of fame. So I guess technically I could say maybe I was in the Tour de France in July 2022. So that's my non-work fact. Kristen, can I turn to you?
Before you do that, I would just add, you were at the back of the pack as well, Chris.
Well, actually, it was downhill, so I was. I almost had the advantage there, Matt. So yeah, Kristen,
steaming to the front. So some of you may know this about me. It's not really a secret, but about 10 years ago, when I was living in London, I studied to be a sommelier. And I was studying with a variety of people who were already in the business. It was really just a passion area for me, and I was really interested in learning more about. So I did consider pursuing a life outside of corporate. I was working at Google at the time, but I ended up not pursuing wine as my full-time job, though I did do some fun work with some startups in the Silicon Roundabout in London. So I learned a lot about what you do day in, day out there, and what I didn't want to do. So I found
Interesting.
myself back in tech and have very much enjoyed it.
I wondered why you wander around sometimes with that tea towel over your forearm there,
Mhm.
Kristen. Now it makes sense. I got it. So, Jason, could you tell us about your non-work related fact?
Yeah, sure. I'd be happy to. And to Kristen's point, the beauty of a good hobby is kind of helps you learn what you like and what you want to do more of, and maybe what you don't want to do so much of,
Right.
which I would say is maybe equally important. So one fun fact for me, I have for the last 3 or 4 years gone incredibly deep down the rabbit hole as it relates to barbecue. If you're familiar, if you've ever ran into a pit boss, as they're often called, uh, it's like religion. I mean, the time and care and energy and focus. And I've got some pretty strong critics in the family. I've stepped my game up, and I've gone from the green egg, I've gone to traditional, gone to the Traeger, so forth. The ultimate, the pinnacle for me, my Tour de France, if you will. I have to convince my dad and my brother to actually like my barbecue, and that is like that is the highest level of acceptance. And I've actually gotten to a point where I've made a couple dishes where they even begrudgingly tell me that it's good, which is probably the best I can
Wow.
ever.
High praise indeed. I love it. Is there a specific dish that they ask you to make for them? What's
They'd
what's
never
the
go that
favorite?
far. That's probably a bridge too far.
Work in progress. Work in progress.
I would say that the go-to is probably my brisket, which is it is kind of a labor of love. When you start getting into some of these different dishes from a smoker perspective, you're talking about 6 hours, 8 hours, 10 hours plus prep. It's often a couple days. So
Wow.
I do it sparingly.
Wow, fantastic. I don't know why, but I'm kind of hungry now. Matt, dare I turn to you, Matt?
Well, I'm going to take away your hunger straight away. So I love services, and it's actually 17 years ago now where I convinced my wife that we should set up a recycling business. And what we were doing was we were turning up to people's houses and we were collecting the used diapers, the used nappies, taking them back to a plant to be recycled back into paper and plastics. And the front of the van, we were proper circular economy. We were delivering brand new Pampers, diapers, and nappies to the new parents. And we ran that business for a couple of years. It certainly had its own aromas. I'm sure they're nowhere near as nice as the wines you were tasting or the brisket. But actually, it was a great business to run and get into. Obviously, morphed into something much bigger than what we could do as a small startup. But it was great fun being able to help new parents overcome challenges. So it's my services foundations were well rewarded in that business.
And I know that you went on Dragon's Den, which I think is that Shark Tank in the States. That one.
It is indeed. Yeah.
Yeah. Interesting.
That was good fun. That was a proper grilling for an hour. That was highly entertaining.
Yeah, just like Jason's, that was proper grilling. Anyway, so moving swiftly on, thank you for that panel. Let's get straight into it then. So what does sales value from enablement, and how does what enablement do help you to really drive those revenue numbers? Let's turn to you first, Jason, if we can on that discussion point.
Sure. Yeah. And first off, Chris, thanks for the time today. I think it's certainly a worthy discussion. I think the first question is probably the one that everyone sort of digests a little bit differently. For me, if you think about sales enablement, I'd probably put a couple of things into the bucket. The first one, and the obvious one, I would say, is along the lines of coaching and training. That's what most people think of. You've got folks in an organization, and you need to make sure that they have the right training and the right coaching. Now, I think the part that maybe gets overlooked a bit when folks sort of put together the word sales and enablement, what often comes next is, it's enablement on the products or services that a company has. And that's certainly an aspect and a component of it. But I think there's a much broader set of areas that are really critical to grow and develop people. For example, if you look at some of the teams that I lead, for the most part, they're focused on one or few customers. And the engagement with those customers, what I would tell you, sort of job one is the most critical thing that these teams can do is to establish and cultivate trust with those companies. And if you're in an organization where there is a broad set of services, a broad set of outcomes that can be delivered for a company, it probably also means that you're not dealing with a single persona for buyers, right? You may be dealing with different functional groups, different lines of business, so forth. And so I would say a healthy component of that training and development is around helping them better understand their customers and better understand the macro environment, geopolitical challenges, all the things that might be impacting that company overall, because that context and insight is actually the thing that helps them usually build and establish trust with those customers. And so I'd say that's maybe the thing that gets overlooked a little bit. Of course, you have content management, you have onboarding and certification, and those elements are super important as well, just so that you can get folks up to speed and moving really quickly. Maybe the last area I would call out is the value of strong communication and really reinforcing and sort of assessing the readiness of your team around critical areas. I think all of those come together to ultimately drive the outcome which you want. In most cases, most organizations, that output looks like pipeline opportunities, and it looks like revenue, and it looks like growth. But I would tell you, enablement broadly impacts a lot of the upstream inputs that lead to the output we want.
Fantastic. Thank you, Jason. Can I open that up to you, Kristen, as well, please?
Yeah, so I would say that the trust piece is so critical in enablement as much as it is in sales, and that's the internal trust of your stakeholders and establishing that, immediately. Knowing who your stakeholders are, knowing who your champions can be, and building almost that internal board of directors that can be your sounding board and your support system as you're building out, your presence in an organization. This helps you understand what's going on in the sales team, really getting into the day-to-day of where bottlenecks are, where some issues are, what's actually happening in the business. And then only then can you actually start thinking about what those programs might be or the processes that need to get implemented. So your enablement kind of kicks in there, but really it's about getting very close to the sales team and staying close. I'll say one more thing in that I think the connection between salespeople on the floor and sales leadership, executive leadership, you can be a bridge to that gap and really help ease the communication so that everybody in the executive branch understands what's going on in the sales floor. Sometimes that gets lost. And so I think that's another important piece of enablement.
Fantastic. Thank you, Kristen. So Matt, what's your lens and perspective on that question?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting you talking about, people perceive it to be coaching and training. And I perceive sales enablement to be, in certainly the companies I've worked with, it's really been a change management function for these companies. And it's, I think the things that I see has been really important there is how do you get very quickly into a clear vision of change and make sure that you've got all of your senior stakeholders on board, you've got all of the sales teams on board, and you're really able to drive and affect change in a way that is going to help you. And I think, where I've seen sales enablement work really, really well in these larger scale change programs is we often call it as sort of like the Fisher-Price Lego effect. It's sales enablement's role is almost to spoon feed the sale. When I was leading a team in Europe, it was a case of we wanted the sellers to be led, spoon-fed every step of the way with the right way to do something. So, we talk about a Fisher-Price, we talk about Lego, but it's, they're synonymous with simplicity and, building something up with your Lego blocks. Simple blocks create a great outcome. So if we can do that as a sales enabler, we're really sort of doing, we can get people doing the doing in a really strong way. And, Chris touched on a little bit my story when I was at HPE and sort of growth we drove there. But actually giving people building blocks does enable organizations to really, really grow and accelerate into a changed outcome as well. So I think keeping it simple and spoon feeding the salespeople great outcomes is one thing I would definitely recommend.
Fantastic. Couldn't
Yeah,
agree
Matt, I
more.
would probably I'd probably add to that. You know, I do think that a really strong enablement function also provides a certain level of agility and agency for the team itself. You know, when you talk about the building blocks, you know, I tend to sort of think about the reality of, I'll go back to what I mentioned. If you have a product or set of services, or even, you know, some companies think about it in terms of a platform, if you have a broad set of things which you can deliver, the permutations of how you might deliver those and who you might deliver it to can be pretty significant. And so I think that's why so many companies sort of start with the first question most companies ask when they think about going down the pathway of driving sales is they say, what is our sales methodology framework? Like we've all talked about it ad nauseum. But I think inside of that framework is often, if you're coaching and developing people on the building blocks inside of it and some of the elements that are really critical, it allows people to have that agency to operate. And you know that it's generally consistent with the approach that you want overall.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Fantastic. Couldn't agree more. So when did the penny drop for you, Jason, around, you know, the value that you were getting from enablement? When did you feel it? How did the Acceler experience change? Can you just take us through your sort of personal journey there where you thought, this is fantastic, I'm feeling this is great?
Yeah, it was probably about 7 or 8 years ago, and I was leading a new team, and that team was focused on actually focused on growing customers and really driving adoption of companies that generally weren't leveraging AWS at the time. And at the time, what I came to realize is that many of the practices that we had in place, the way that we thought about sales execution and engagement, at the time, it was generally focused on a sort of an assumption that those companies had already started leveraging the cloud. And so as a result, you can imagine a great many things were different when we started thinking about the aspects of onboarding and accelerating adoption of a company. You know, the way I might sort of categorize it as, at the time, our position was we are trying to help people build houses, and we have a lot of the components to help them in building a house. Well, the reality was for many of those companies, they hadn't set the foundation yet. And so we actually had to go back and really think about what are the elements of that are really critical from an onboarding, training, enablement, assessment perspective, and how do we help our team show up better? And the first question was, how do we make sure that we're landing the message of the value proposition for cloud? Even then, even back then, you had companies that, you know, I would say most enterprise companies had started that pathway and that shift. So you can imagine companies that hadn't, there were really good reasons for it. And so you were kind of fighting gravity and inertia. In some cases, it was, you know, business challenges internally. Some cases, there were long-haired beliefs about, you know, what goes on inside of our four walls. And so we really had to change the way that we drove the enablement more directly, because we realized the engagement was so different with customers initially.
Okay, so with that in mind, what were the types of things that enablement did? How did they do that? It sounds almost like a messaging marketing type of thing. You're talking about deep held beliefs. There was some inertia that you talked about there. What was it that enablement did for your sellers that really helped them to overcome that?
Yeah, so to be clear, it certainly wasn't just enablement, because in some cases we had to go build things to support those customers, particularly to help them sort of onboard initially. But the first thing I would say is making sure that our teams had a broad understanding of the game to be played, if you will. If you kind of think about it, within most organizations, if they're going to focus on a new cohort of customers or a new, you know, whether that's a new industry, a new phase, so forth, in most cases, they're probably going to leverage some of the resources and people that may already exist within the organization. So in this case, we actually did the same thing. So we had folks that were experienced and very knowledgeable, but they were highly knowledgeable about customers within a certain phase of adoption. And so we had to really go back and say, but this is a different phase. So how do we think about the development and growth of the individual to counsel them so they could be really effective with customers in that phase? The second aspect I would tell you is, while this certainly isn't the case today, if you go back a decade ago, I would tell you that for many of the customers that were leveraging the cloud, if you were to look at who were some of those personas and who were the folks that we were often dealing with, they were often technologists, right? Your office of the CIO, office of the CTO. And if you really want to enact change and drive that from a top-down perspective, you're not only dealing with the CIO and CTO, of course. And so there's a lot of energy that had to go into how do we become even more relevant at an individual level. The reality is for any company, if you're selling to another company, your company is whoever shows up at the front door for that company, right? The seller, the solution architect, the CSM, whoever shows up on the doorstep, that's who your company is. And so we had to make sure that they could be effective, whether they were talking to the board, whether they were talking to the COO, whether they were talking to an enterprise architect. So we realized we needed to have sort of a flexible framework to help our individuals be strong in that conversation. Also, if you have an organization where there's a lot of different services or products that you can deliver to support a customer, the number of permutations and the way that you might train someone becomes quite voluminous. And that's part of the reason why we focus so heavily on the customer and making sure that we had a very good understanding of some of the biggest challenges or opportunities, because we can work backwards from that. And then once we understood more of where those companies were, then we could start thinking about it from a service perspective and some of the horizontals that we needed to make sure folks were developed on. So it actually sort of became a sequencing event.
Okay, fascinating. Now, that's really nice to hear. I'm scribbling away. I'm quite old school with a pen and paper. Take notes, scribble quotes, as they say. So that's really, really interesting, that story. Matt, can I turn to you on that very topic of when the penny sort of dropped for you and you saw that value and felt that you were driving that value?
Yeah, it's probably the inverse of the Jason story from an HPE perspective, because at the time we were, we were trying to pivot the business. AWS were cloud first, customers everywhere you went had a cloud first strategy, and we had a legacy of data, a legacy in the footprint in the data center of these companies, and we were trying to change. I think if I go back to where the sellers were at the time, they were going out every quarter with a product roadmap, and they're having conversations at a lower level than you were even talking about there, about the product roadmap, the innovations, and that's the pedigree that HP was built on. Great product, very reliable. No one got fired for buying HPE. But you're in a situation though where you suddenly had this massive new entrant flooding the marketplace, and we were bridged into this room up in Glasgow. It felt a little bit like the Ryder Cup. We had the Americans and the Europeans all coming together in one location to spend 5 days planning our counterattack, if you will, on how can we be relevant in the conversation. And I think, there's lots of great ideas were in there, but we really honed in on the seller experience at HP. If we want to take salespeople on a journey with us, we really have to get into the gritty reality of their environment. What is the seller experience really like? At the time, trying to sell the alternative to the cloud was, by the time you could have gone onto AWS's website and populated a quotation for some compute, I was still writing out my forms for request for resources to help me align pricing, finance, technical resources. It was taking me 45 minutes just to request a bid team in order to be able to compete against you for something that you could consume on the web. And so we had to go through the whole seller experience and sort of almost rewrite the mindset of, say, what does it need to feel like being an employee in this organization? How do we understand the gritty reality of what a day in the sales process is like? How do we take the best practices and accelerate into those? And the outcome of that session was we got down to, sub 5 minutes quoting with a contracted price. Previously, that was taking 2 or 3 weeks to do. It was binding. We changed the mindset. It took about probably 3 months for us to really get around the organization and get people to buy into it. Because prior to that, we were facing active resistance every step of the way from the senior leaders, from the managers, and we almost had to drive that change and change it from a seller perspective and seller experience, and try and improve that for not just the HPE sellers, but for the channel teams as well. to enable them to be able to compete, still selling the products and services that they knew as well. So if I go back 10 years, it really was a fascinating time, and it was really interesting, sort of the impact I think you actually had on the industry, and how we had to sharpen our own mindsets that in order to compete and drive the change there. So it was an interesting time.
Interesting. Yeah. So when Jason was talking, I scribbled down agility and agency, and I scribbled down strong in the conversation. I could have done the same for what you just said there, Matt. So that's really interesting. Kristen, what's your take on this point?
I would say that what we're talking about here is enablement moving from a kind of training function to actually driving change, to being an enabler inside of the organization. And so it's figuring out what that gritty reality looks like and understanding how you can help, but really getting into the mindset of a seller and being able to progress, and unblock things for them. And then I think there was a lot of talk about kind of leaders being on the same page, leaders blocking things. If you don't have your executive sponsorship for anything you're doing as an enabler, that's key. Ensuring that you have your champions in decision-making places, and so that you can understand what's moving, what's changing, and being that conduit to the sales team that's necessary.
Okay, fascinating. So thank you for that, Kristen. I couldn't agree more. So why is this hard to do? Why is this hard to achieve, to drive? Kristen, tell me about what your take is on this. I think Jason described it as inertia earlier on, and Matt has described it as active resistance and things. Why are we getting this? Where is this coming from?
Exhaustion, in some ways, burnout. I think sellers have a lot on their plate, and you'll hear all different iterations of that. But this is just another initiative, and if you're framing it as a training, if you're framing it as learning, it's just another initiative that they have to box tick and get out of their way in order to do their job. And so often thinking about enablement as kind of a all up, I need to build a program, I need to build a behemoth that I then launch to a big fanfare. It's not a marketing campaign. You're not doing a branding campaign. You need to be working a lot more in a customized fashion, and with tools that are coming, that are very mainstream now in terms of AI and all of the ways that we can integrate that into the sales flow. Your job moves from being a one-size-fits-all model to a really personalized, just-in-time approach. And the tools that we have now are actually enabling the enablers to do that more effectively. So it's looking at that, the actual situation, the gritty reality of what a seller is dealing with on a day-to-day basis, and figuring out how you can help in the sales flow, how you can help in their workflow. And again, kind of driving alignment within the leadership. So you'll get top-down edicts, and that's where the box ticking can happen. You need to train all of my sellers, make sure you have that input metric. And really what you're trying to do is what you're trying to do is drive more win rate. You need to increase the number of opportunities that are actually going through the flow, or you need to progress things from stage to stage, and you need to be qualifying your leads more. So there's real business outcomes that you're looking to drive.
Fantastic. Yeah, we had a really good question come in around cynicism. So I really smiled when I saw that, because we've recently released a podcast episode on that exact topic. So as a sales leader, you're met with a healthy degree, let's say, of cynicism from the sales team, let alone as an enablement leader. So we've all seen it in that position where people sort of listen to what's being said and what's being asked, they nod, they smile, but they're not going to do it. So sellers have this sort of tricky, sort of uncanny way of initially looking at something that they're being asked to do and very quickly assess what's in it for my customers, what's in it for me. They do this quick calculation. Can we deliver it? Should I spend my time there? So they're listening, but they're working through this calculation. So, my take on this is cynicism is healthy. You want a cynical salesperson. Why? Because if you think about where that cynicism is coming from, it's coming from a place of, I want to protect my relationship with the customer. I want to show value back to the customer. Can I monetize this value for my customer, for myself? So it's coming from a position where they may have been burnt in the past as well, and they're looking for answers to these questions. And at an event that we drove recently in London, we were looking at the evidence-based approach, almost in a legal kind of, we were getting people to think about it almost in a legal approach where you would put forward the arguments, you put forward the evidence, you would convince these people and show these people that the why and the how, and getting these people on board so they're in a position, as Jason said earlier, assessing that readiness for change. So Matt, what is your take on this, why it's difficult, and this cynicism piece as well that we've had come in? What's your lens on that?
So I think generally, and unless you really understand the reality, you're going to, if you're new in role, you're going to get lots of different opinions on the organization. So cutting through the noise is really tough as well. So getting to the gritty reality is really important. I also think salespeople will actually actively tell you that they're all selling value and they're all positioning value all of the time. And, I think the reality is that we see is often it's not the case. And I think, Kristen, we were talking earlier in the week when we're doing a piece of work at the moment with a company where we're interviewing the salespeople. We've got a process we go through, and 9 times out of 10, you're at this point where they're, you're thinking, God, these are great. They're really actively selling value. They're positioning all the way through. And that's, to Jason's point earlier, they're talking to us about how they're selling it to different personas, etc. And then we ask a really basic question, which is, how do you position the company you work for to your friends at a barbecue? So you've turned up at Jason's house, the brisket's on, Kristen's doing the wine. How do you position what you do to these two? And I'll tell you what, very few people answer that in a position of value. They almost default back to explaining the company, the features of the company, and what the company does. Very few naturally gravitate towards the value and the impact they have. So I think, as an enabler and a sales leader, cutting through that, you obviously can't be in every single call, but you've got to get people into that mindset and almost get them to do the doing actively and embed that best practice of leading with value, talking with value. It's like Jason said right at the start about you'd rock up to different personas. I made the transition from working in the legal sector to working in finance, and I walked into the AE to do some planning. First thing he said to me was, how are you going to improve to this customer? How are we going to demonstrate the cost impact ratio? And what's the positive impact we're going to have on his cost impact ratio? That's his number one priority, Matt. What we're going to do. I didn't even know what cost impact ratio was. So, I knew all the KPIs in the legal sector, no idea what it was in the banking one. But, 10 years on, we've now got tools, and we use them quite actively, that can actually help spoon feed, just-in-time enablement. So actually, when I'm now sitting on a call and someone says to me, tell me, what's the cost impact ratio? I now know because I'm being served it in near real time. So I can, so I've got the skills to handle the question, taking and I think that's where I see the real benefit around, so we've got lots of headwinds where people think they know what they're doing, getting to actively do it on a day in, day out basis. The reality is somewhat slightly different, but I think, as we move forward with AI advancements, we can absolutely help close that gap and tackle some of those headwinds straight on in terms of making sure that actually what we want people to do and say is actively done in the right way, and people start to embed what we think is the best practice.
I totally agree, Matt. I think, the more programs we run around the world for our clients, it never ceases to amaze me what people know versus what they do. So that technology and that change management that we talked about earlier, actually getting into the doing it, turning things into a practice. I mean, one of our straplines is making best practice your practice, which is something that it really keeps it sustainable, and it makes the difference. It's so powerful. Jason, what is the kind of inertia that you've faced into when you've asked or you've wanted sellers to act in a slightly different way? What's the type of cynicism and inertia that you've come across in that environment? How have you dealt with that as a sales leader?
Well, you know, the first thing is, so going back to the previous question around, you know, what is some of the friction you wind up seeing or experiencing? I think the first thing I would say is most folks that are in sales, go-to-market, business development, most of them care first and foremost on delivering a result and an outcome for their customer. That's the reality of it. And if I told you that I had insight or a way that I could help you be more, excuse me, more effective for your customer, you'd probably say, great, I'm in. I think the challenge is, and the gap is often, and obviously Matt spoke to this, just in time. The question is the insight and the information that I'm acquiring, or that I'm being asked to really sort of digest and to really make it my own, is it valuable right now? Can I understand where it might be valuable and applicable today? And I think that's where often the gap comes in, Chris. I think when you're in a position to really land that message across the team, and once again, if you are a broad organization with many different products and services, and you're supporting many different customers, I think there's a tendency to dilute the messaging so it's applicable everywhere. Now, to that point, we have the good fortune of a number of technologies and tools that make that much easier to be more granular and specific. So, you know, if you think about what is the difference of how we might position a set of products or services from a technology perspective to a legal company, you know, as Matt mentioned, versus to a healthcare and life sciences company that's focused on, you know, drug development. The messaging and the value proposition and the problem statement that we're solving for could actually be vastly different. And so the first thing I would say is making sure that you're being very granular and specific about the outcomes that you can deliver and that you can help the individual deliver directly for a customer. And then secondarily, and I think this is a huge aspect that we've seen in sales enablement over the years across any number of different companies, which is their ability to take in more signals, to understand not just where the individual is, but also where the customer is within a period of time. And so when you can see those signals and say, we know that this is a challenge. Look at a 10K, look at an annual you know, statement. We know this is a problem for this customer. And if this is a problem for this customer, we know that these are specific things that we can do to help that company. Now, how do we enable the individual? And are we sure the individual sees that as a challenge and a problem statement for the customer as well? Because when those things intersect, then I think you get high buy-in, and you really see folks really lean in to understand and develop a point of view based on a lot of the enablement work that you would do. I think that is how you solve for the challenge and sort of jumpstart that inertia. I think the other aspect of it is, and this isn't a surprise to anyone here, I'm sure, you really do have to catch people doing something right. And then you have to communicate that and really provide visibility to it to the rest of the organization. And it's for me personally, that catching people doing something right does not often mean or always mean, and look at the big deal and all the revenue that came afterwards. It's actually, if you can tell the story and work backwards of, we saw a problem statement or a challenge for a customer. It may or may not have even been realized by the customer themselves. And this is the way that we leaned in. These are the resources we brought. This is what we did. And this is the actual outcome. Internal case studies and internal references are incredibly valuable for driving the buy-in that you want across the organization, because the individuals in your organization start to see what success looks like. You're basically non-verbally communicating the undercurrent or the foundation of what do we really want to see and what does success look like, and then people want to see themselves in that success.
Absolutely, absolutely. I remember, you know, years ago we manually developed something where we were running these sales community calls, and we were pulling out the best bits from the sales perspective. So not necessarily focusing on the product in isolation. It was more about where did it grip in the sales process, what was said, what was done, when did the dynamic shift, how did you uncover value, all those sorts of things that the sales community wants to really get their teeth into. And then we recorded those and shared those. But these days, of course, we can have that same principle, but using really great tools out there like Aircover and various things that will sit inside of the environment and help at the point of need. So really interesting the way that dynamic is accelerating. How do you drive cost, risk, and time from the desired seller behavior changes, and what role do you play in making that work? Can I go to you first, Kristen, on that topic?
Yeah, so the thing that I would start off with is, I guess, what Jason was saying of find who's doing things right. Find your example of good. What does good look like? I guess backing up, what is the business problem? And what are we actually dealing with that we're seeing across the organization? Is it speed to close? Is it the top of the funnel is too light? Is it qualifying opportunities? Defining that, but then finding out where the good is, defining it, and then starting small and proving big. So de-risk for leadership any program you're talking about by testing it with pilots. So take that good, that version of good, and create a program, create something that you can launch and actually show some quick results off of. That builds social proof internally. It also builds champions across the sales floor and the management team. So doing that and then talking about this is a thing that we want to launch and this is what we want to do across the organization. I would also say that the just in time, we've said that a lot, and just for me. So the what's in it for me needs to be front and center of any enablement that you're doing. It brings it home for your customers who are your internal sellers. It tells them why we're doing this thing, how it's going to help them improve in their jobs or be better for their customers. And so pairing that with just-in-time learning, figuring out, the tech that you need to do that, but most importantly, the strategy of when you need to be there to help sellers ease through different blockages and unlock that potential.
Okay. Thank you, Kristen. So, Matt, what's your perspective on that in terms of driving cost, risk, and time out of that seller behavior change process?
I think the best way to get to that process is for everyone to work together as one team and one effort. And I think we do a lot of work with sort of new enroll CROs or sales leaders, and I think the one bit of advice we often give is around, so Kristen just touched on there, is actually slow down to speed up. So one of the things we do a lot of is really get into the propensity and capability of the seller. So what we're doing there is really trying to drive into those best practices. What are the best practices the top performers are doing? How do you then start to make that habitual? And then what are the headwinds that the company is facing into? Because I think once you can start to understand the real headwinds from a seller perspective, and I think if we went and interviewed 100 people today, we're going to get a lot of noise. But it's how do you really cut through that noise to try and fix the problems that are going to make the biggest impact? One of the things we talked about when we were at HP was, building this. Everyone said the problem is, you need to build a price. We need to be at a price quicker. That was the exam question we were set really when we were trying to compete against AWS with the cloud. The reality wasn't that. The reality was we needed to get to value quicker with the customers. So, we had everyone telling us, filling in surveys, but actually when we interviewed people, we got to the gritty reality, which was they were still giving prices. They were just getting a no a bit quicker because they hadn't landed the value. So I think, taking that step back, really understanding your own gritty reality, and then accelerating, as Kristen was saying, once you've proven it works, doubling down on that is so important. And I think, that comes from teamwork, and that comes from sales leaders, sales executives, company executives, and the sellers all working as one and pushing in the common direction, because ultimately we're all shareholders of the same company. We all have the same goals, and we should all see it wanting to work well. And I think sometimes I see politics getting in the way of that and the active resistance. And I think if you can cut through that with a clear plan that everyone buys into, that can really help you take cost, risk, and time out of your transformations.
Yeah, I think when Jason was talking earlier, he was talking about assessing readiness for change. So, I'm just thinking back of the last half dozen sort of global programs that we've run, Matt, and that element up front around the propensity, how do they feel about change? What do they understand? Why it's getting all those things, and the capability almost ahead of the program is given really good results, because it shows where the people are versus where they need to be, current state, future state, and it allows you as an enablement leader to underpin those gaps with some good investments. So doing that almost ahead of the program has shown, in my mind, the clients that we work with, that's been a real positive and a differentiator for them within the market and their job roles. That's just been great for us. Jason, in terms of driving cost, risk, and time out of the sellers that you work with in your teams, what are the things that come to mind as to how you reduce cost, risk, and time of seller behavior change?
Yeah, I think it's kind of interesting. I tend to think that for a lot of the strongest leaders, what they do well is that they sort of consternate over the smallest unit of work. And you can choose what a unit of work is depending on the business that you're talking about and the role and so forth. If you think about it from a sales go-to-market perspective, I would say one unit of work you can consider is an opportunity. And people talk about what an opportunity looks like in different ways, but most sales organizations think about pipeline, they think about how much they're creating, they think about how they're progressing it, they think about what they're launching, how it shows up. And to the earlier point that Matt made, I think really understanding, I think the term was gritty reality. I think about it as the smallest unit of work and what happens at each stage and phase within that unit of work. Who are the folks that have to touch that unit of work and what comes through on the other side? And I think if you're really going to dig into assessing the costs, and it's worth noting, maybe an aside, and it's an important one. If you think about it as the company that you're in, one really important element to consider is what is the potential lifetime value of the engagement, of the lifetime value of that customer? And if what you're selling is really a product or service that you will in fact sell once, or where you sell many things many times, and you're going to continue to build things that you'll land with those customers, because it'll probably make you think a little bit differently about your acquisition costs. It'll probably make you think a little bit differently about even your investment costs as it relates to enablement overall. So it's super important to know which game you're playing. Now, with that said, if you think about it from a customer perspective, what I would say, that smallest unit of work, an opportunity, if you will, the really interesting aspect that I think often gets missed for most organizations, particularly if you're selling something that has many services and many different use cases or outcomes that you can deliver, often with each opportunity, you're increasing the number of contacts or individuals that you may be engaging with inside that organization as well. And so that value is not just in sort of delivering an outcome, but it's also in increasing your relationship map. It's a number of folks that you can actually cultivate and build relationships with, and subsequently probably learn a lot more about what's actually happening in a company. One of the things we value a ton is making sure that we fully understand who the customer is and have that 360-degree view. That's actually difficult to do if you only know a couple of people in an organization. Even if that person happens to be the CEO, you really must know a broad group of stakeholders and to get a lot of that insight and the input. So if you go back, so I guess what I would say is, first off, foundationally, make sure you understand the opportunity and the long-term opportunity with a customer, and that you're not having a one-sided sort of discussion with yourself about the costs and how do you optimize that effectively. Once you have that in place, I would say the next piece is to make sure that you understand how much resourcing is needed and when to support the individuals in your sales team. And this sort of goes back to something Kristen said. When you're thinking about that engagement with your customers through the lens of the people, I think the big question is, what are the elements we need to bring right now to this team or to this individual to make them successful? And then how do we get the signal back that they were successful in that component? Now, how do we get them ready for the next? It turns out if you look at a engagement with a customer, and I'll go back to the point of the smallest unit work. Let's look at an opportunity. Let's assume an opportunity has 20 stages for which at the other end, you have a successful opportunity launch with a customer where the customer is given the value they want. If you can guide the seller on the first 2 or 3 components and they're very successful and they realize that the reason they've been successful is because of the enablement, the counsel, the coaching that you've provided, you probably won't have to push very hard to get them bought in on the next 17. They realize that their success is coming through their learnings and through the adoption of those skills.
Great stuff. Great stuff. Thank you, Jason. I think it's really interesting for the enablement leaders on the call around how you're viewing the customer strategically over time. The long-term view is good for budget for enablement. You're looking at that in a slightly different way rather than at a programmatic level, which is fascinating and no doubt really effective. What advice for senior sales leaders and enablement leaders when they're new in role? So let me come to you, Matt, on that particular topic. How does what you know and practice fit for different size companies as well? So if we take the new in role point first, I know we had a question come in on that. So Matt, could you take us through your thoughts on that one?
Yeah, no, so I think when you're new in role, again, I sort of touched on a lot of this earlier around my advice is absolutely slow down to speed up. Really understand the problems and the reality, and I think it was almost like break it down into a number of different areas. So you almost like benchmark where the sales you want to almost, in my opinion, benchmark where the sales team are at today. What's their propensity? What's their capability? And then break it down in terms of what are the headwinds they're facing into, and what can we do to overcome the headwinds that are really bottlenecks. And what are the best practices my top sellers are doing, and how can I use tech and process to really help those top sellers become, the common practice across the teams? How can you accelerate? And there are so many different areas you can dive into, but I think we often, and a lot of people will talk about the short tenure of a CRO, for example, and it's fairly commonplace, but a lot of the times you get the ones that are most successful really do slow down, really understand the reality, and then accelerate forward. And I think that's, when I've met a lot of CROs over the last few years, the common traits I see coming across is just support the team in the areas where you can to make best practice, the practice. So if you can get your top sellers, or you get your average sellers operating like your top sellers, then you're on a growth path.
Okay, thank you, Matt. So very quickly, we've talked a lot about what we see really working and gripping in the market out there. So what's the most expensive, on the flip side of the coin, what's the most expensive enablement mistake that you've seen where good intentions have led to wasted time, money, perhaps trust? What are the expensive enablement mistakes that spring to mind? Who wants to answer that first? Kristen, can I pick on you?
Sure. So I would say, kind of going back to the previous question, applies here as well, is taking a cookie cutter approach to, this is what worked before at my previous company, I'm just going to lift and shift it, move it over. As an enabler, as a senior enabler, there's kind of a 3-step process I would follow, and that's to listen. So if it's going on a listening tour, if it's just meeting everybody that you can, all of the different stakeholders, go into a diagnosis to understand where you're seeing the blockages or the issues, and then align with all of those stakeholders that you have been in touch with. And then do one thing. So pick 1 or 2, but probably 1 major initiative that will drive change quickly. And in that first 90 days, just prioritize that one thing, do it really well, and learn to say no and get people used to hearing you say no.
Okay. Very good. So, Jason, in your view, mistakes. What have you seen?
I would probably call it two areas. The first thing I would say is driving enablement around services or products in mass. And particularly, I think often what you'll see in some organizations, we're building out this product or we have a new service that we're launching. Let's train everyone on this service. I would say the reason why that's very expensive is because let's assume for a moment everyone in your organization at one point will have an opportunity to sell a product or a service. But if it happens over the course of a year and after you've launched that product, the reason that enablement is very expensive is because you have to train them twice. There's a very high likelihood that a lot of the context and insight is just lost to the memory. That's the reality of it. And so that's obviously the reason why just-in-time enablement matters so much. So I'd say that's the first component is training for a specific service. The second piece I would say is, and it kind of goes back to what Kristen said, I would say training in mass. The first thing is, am I sure that what we intend to guide and coach our teams on is broadly applicable and realized across every customer and across every team? If the answer is yes, then enablement in mass makes sense on a specific topic. I think we find that occurs less and less frequently. And for those sets of things where that is the case, that's what you make a part of onboarding. That's what you make a part of sort of maybe biannually from a training perspective. But I think being really critical and declarative about are the people that we're landing this with the right audience right now?
Yeah.
It's fascinating
Excellent.
what you say there as well, because I think one of the things that I think causes lots of programs to fail is you don't get people doing the doing. So you say about doing it twice. For me, it's around how do you get sellers doing the doing the following day from the training, and how do you embed it over the next 18 months so that when you launch your next service, you're not going back over the skills and the processes. It's almost ingrained in the company, but you're trying to get them to do that. And I think that's where I see a lot of mistakes happen, where you're right, people don't necessarily take the time to think about who really does need to be on this program and how do we make this effective.
Okay, thank you, Matt. Yeah, I couldn't agree more. It's all around generating a practice, isn't it? We've had a question come in from Robin. I think if we can just answer this in the last 30 seconds. How do you manage the consultative benchmark and skill set you need for your sales team at the foundation to be able to customize value of their clients and prospects? Who wants to take that one? Matt or Kristen, is that one that you've seen in the room? Can you pick that one up?
So I think, for me, I think this is, Chris, I think this is really about how do you bench? I think there's a couple of things in there. It's probably about how do you benchmark your sales team? So I think there's definitely some propensity and capability assessments you could easily run to benchmark and the skill. And I think then absolutely, how do you get the teams doing the doing? I think for me, this is around, we've done this in the past. It's about how do you really quickly get them, get your teams to really understand the value. So Jason touched on earlier things around like understanding the customer, doing your homework around the 10K, diving into the actual philosophical pains this customer is going to be buying into as well. So getting into the heart of the customer and then making sure that you're talking their language. You're not showing up and saying, "Hi, I'm from this company. We're great." You've got to put yourself in the shoes of the customer and talk their language all the way through and solve their real problems. So I think there's lots of ways you can do that at scale. And I think actually it's much easier to do that now than it was maybe even 5 years ago. So I think there's definitely some things you can focus on around how do you put yourself in the shoes of the customer.
Yeah, the one thing I would say on that, the propensity and capability is spot on for getting you there as an enablement leader. I think I'd focus less on comparable industries, comparable skills. It's more about current state versus desired state within your seller experience and journey.
Yeah.
Where do you want these people to be? So it's less of a benchmark industry wide or whatever. We're seeing that less of value in the market right now. And the more of the value, I think you'd agree with me here, Kristen, it's around desired state versus where they are currently. That's the bit that you need to try and get a handle on as really, really quickly.
Yeah, I would say that there's a need to be very intelligent and strategic about your tech stack there as well. So think very thoughtfully about how you bring in tech to help you build those benchmarks, help you build those reports. It can be really helpful or it can get in the way. But that would be something to look out for.
Fantastic. We are at time. I feel a little bit guilty. I know we have some questions in front of me unanswered. So we'll write to you individually. Please carry on the conversation on LinkedIn as well. Please connect with us. And we hopefully will see you on the next panel very soon. And enjoy your weekend and good luck to the Americans on the call for the Ryder Cup, but maybe not that much luck. Okay. Thank you, everybody. It's been fantastic. See you again soon on the next panel.
Thanks,
Bye now.
everyone.